Hi, welcome to the final video in our SUP series. My name's Craig, I'm the Chief Instructor at Polkerris Beach, and today I'm going to be talking about how to plan your first SUP tour. Once you've got to grips with the basics, natural progression is to begin exploring your local area and start paddling in different locations and planning some longer trips. For a first time tour, I'd assume you've done a number of short 1 to 2 hour paddles and a similar distance to where you plan to go. For a first time tour, you should start by finding an area of water that already has a number of paddleboard users, or by using certain paddling apps like SUP or Go Paddling. These will give you an idea of routes to take, and there should be a lot of information to hand on how to stay safe. There are a number of fitness apps you can use that will give you a good idea of your average paddle speed, and you can use this to plan how far you want to go on your trip and how long it will take. I'd recommend paddling a maximum of 50 metres from the coastline so you're able to self-rescue paddle back to the land. It's also much more picturesque than heading straight out into the wide open sea. Your safety is a key aspect when planning a trip, so once you've found your route, you'll want to make a note of any beaches, slipways, or any place that could give you emergency access back to the land if you suddenly need it or if the weather takes a turn for the worse. Have a look at Google Maps to assist with this, and also to make a note of any rocky areas or hazards at your proposed landing site. If you have access to any charts of the area you are heading to, they will have a lot of really useful information as well. Any local water users will also be a great source of information for any localised weather effects or things to look out for, so checking with the harbour offices or somewhere like Polkerris Beach is encouraged. I use Google Maps to work out the approximate distance for a paddle from Polkerris to the Gribbon Day marker and back, which is about 5 kilometres. If this was a first time tour, I'd want to make sure I paddle at least a couple of kilometres comfortably beforehand. Another important aspect of planning your trip is to plan what you'll take with you. The distance, weather, and how isolated your trip will be will all affect the type and amount of equipment you'll want to take. The items I believe you must have with you on any trip would be a buoyancy aid or personal flotation device to make sure you stay safe if you do happen to fall in, a means of communication such as a phone in a waterproof case, a way to attract attention to yourself like a whistle or brightly coloured flag, so if anything were to prevent you from making it back to the shore or you were stuck somewhere remote, you have a much higher chance of being spotted and being rescued. A device to keep track of the time so you'll know if you're on schedule and hopefully won't be caught out, missing the tide or any time sensitive parts of your trip. A dry bag to store everything in and enough drinking water to keep you going. The correct clothing for the weather. This might be your winter wetsuit, a waterproof jacket or a wide brimmed hat depending on the forecast you've already checked. And of course plenty of biscuits or your preferred snack. Some extra considerations for what to pack will be informed by the weather conditions. If it's going to be a hot, low wind day, I might choose to wear my summer wetsuit, put some sunscreen on and pack extra water. If the forecast suggests it might get cooler or windier later in the day, I'd pack a windproof jacket or some extra layers to stay warm. There's a huge list of things you could bring with you and things you might need. Things like a spare paddle if yours breaks, a tow line to help someone in your group, or a chart of the area. If you're only going to be paddling 50 metres from a shore, there's plenty of exit points. They probably aren't necessary, but it's worth thinking about and considering in your plan. As a final part of your plan, make sure you've told someone on the land where you're going, when you plan to head out, and when you are hoping to make it back. This means that if anything were to go wrong, someone will know to look for you. You want to start by checking the tides and weather conditions. It's important to know the conditions to ensure you'll be safe out on the water, and it will inform where you want to go and possibly for how long. There are a number of websites to check the tides. I like to use the tide table book, but remember to make sure it's the right year. If you're going to an unfamiliar area and you haven't found any local knowledge, then it'd be a good idea to get your hands on a chart which shows lots of tidal information. If you look for the letters in the circle, or sometimes it's a diamond, that's closest to where you will be paddling, then reference the table. This will tell you the direction of flow, speed, and if it's a spring or neap tide, all in relation to hours before or after high water. You can see the same information here, but with arrows showing the relevant information instead. The tide will affect when you want to leave and plan to come back. I'd suggest you leave at a time that lets you go with the tide on the journey there and have enough time to stop and rest, maybe eat your lunch and head back with the returning tide. So if you look on here, on Friday the 5th of June, low tide is 12:14 p.m. So if you plan to head out with the ebbing tide, it should make it a little easier for you. I can also see by the depth of the water that it's moving into spring tides, which means more water will be moving in the same 6-hour period, so it'll be moving faster than on a neap tide. Once you've reached your destination and had time for lunch, you should plan to return on the incoming tide and therefore making it much easier to paddle back. So in this example, any time after 12:14. However, the fastest moving point of any tide is the middle 2 hours, so between 2 and 4. With this in mind, it's worth noting that a lot of places will be affected differently by the tide. When paddling at Polkerris, the effect of the tide is minimal, but just around the headland in the Foy estuary, there are parts that you would not want to be caught paddling against the tide. The main consideration when checking the weather will be the wind and temperature. I use a combination of Wind Guru and XC Weather to get a good picture of what I can expect out on the water. You should always avoid heading out when the visibility is poor. Offshore winds can be especially dangerous as you can't always tell how windy it is on the sea until it's too late, and strong winds can cause the sea state to become quite rough, depending on the distance the wind has travelled over the water. You'll also possibly end up down while the wind just blows you. Wind speed and direction could completely change where you plan to go and how long it could take to get there. Using local knowledge to plan your trip, you should take into account the strongest element, either wind or tide. In St Austell Bay, it's usually the wind. It's always advisable to paddle into the wind to start your journey, partly because this will be the toughest part of the paddle, so it's best to tackle it when you have the most energy. It also means that on the journey back, you're likely to be going with the wind, which will make it much easier to head home. It's very useful to find out of any localised conditions where you plan to paddle. If there is an easterly wind in St Austell Bay, you can head out from Polkerris Beach and stay nice and sheltered along the coastline for the majority of the trip. If it's a hot day and the forecast is for light winds, it's likely that a sea breeze will kick in, usually in the afternoon. This can make it feel quite windy on the beach and add to the challenge of launching and paddling upwind. Certain places can be affected by this more than others. So if we use the example from Wind Guru, you can see it shows you the date and time, the average wind speed in knots, the speed of the gusts, the direction and the temperature. On Tuesday the 2nd, you can see for most of the day the wind is very light, at around 5 knots for most of the morning. This would be ideal for paddleboarding. However, those gusts of 10 knots will add a bit of a challenge every now and then. With the direction changing so much, it indicates the wind will stay nice and light, but this means it could be affected more by a sea breeze as the land heats up during the day. This forecast is almost perfect for a trip along to the Gribben day marker. The first leg will be paddling into the wind, and then when the tide turns and it's time to come back, the wind will be pushing us along as well, making the return effortless. Using the forecast from XC Weather, you can see all the same information. A few of the wind speeds and temperatures may differ, but they both give a pretty good picture of what the day will be like. However, if we look at the example for Saturday the 6th, you can see by 10 AM there could be gusts of 28 knots, almost twice the recommended upper limit for paddleboarding. The northwesterly wind also means that any trip heading out from Polkerris will be at their destination in no time, but heading back will be incredibly challenging. As the wind only has a few hundred metres to blow along the water, it won't affect the sea state and create as many waves as other directions would, but it still won't be a pleasant trip. If you're going on a trip with more equipment on your board than you're used to, it's a good idea to load it all up and have a practice beforehand. You might find that you're much slower with the extra equipment and will have to adjust your timing accordingly. And if it's been sitting in the garage all winter, make sure you check everything over before heading onto the water to make sure it's still water worthy. When you are on the water, you will need to keep an eye on the conditions. The forecasts are great, but they're not infallible. If you see clouds towering up on the horizon, more clouds appearing or dark clouds building, then be prepared for some wind and rain. And make sure you go with other paddleboarders. It's much safer and it will be much more fun. Thanks very much for watching our final video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them on the video or you can email us. Thanks again.